Welcome to Season 3 of the Visibility Gap podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Guy Winch. Nearly 1 in 10 men experience depression or anxiety, but less than half receive treatment. This season, we're addressing the disconnect between how men appear and what they're actually feeling. Many misread their mental health symptoms or try to push through their challenges alone and in silence, even as the emotional and physical consequences grow. That silence follows men into their homes, relationships, and work. Today we'll talk about how traditional masculinity norms keep men quiet, fuel loneliness, and delay treatment, and how to spot symptoms, speak up, and get support. This season, we're intentionally centering on men's voices, creating space for men to speak openly, listen to one another, and break the habit of keeping mental health struggles to themselves. To begin our discussion, we'll talk with CJ Koegel, a fitness professional who through experience and therapy is actively reshaping his own definition of manhood and fatherhood. CJ, welcome to the Visibility Gap.
Thank you so much. I am so happy to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. Father of 3, 5-year-old, 2-year-old, and 8-month-old. Wonderful wife named Bree. Shout out to them. They're my rocks.
Growing up, how did you define traditional masculinity, and how has that definition evolved over time for today?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think traditional masculinity to me then was kind of what you saw in movies or TV shows. Muscular, the Hulk, those kind of guys. My dad, bodybuilder, kind of firefighter guy, big, strong. A lot of I present to the world in this way. So a lot of external masculinity. But there were certain topics that really made my dad cry. His dad died when he was 6, so there's certain movies that hit on that topic where he would get really emotional. But outside of that, I think firefighter, paramedic, in a position of like, I gotta be tough, maybe I don't show. So his words compared to how he was actually presenting it, I think we're a little off, and I focus on that now as a dad. So I think that having a well-rounded version of yourself, I think for me is real masculinity.
So it's interesting because your dad didn't show much. He said it was okay, but he didn't really show much in terms of expressing emotion or pain. And as you said, your cultural and your environment, what you saw in movies and on television, was that men are not supposed to express, pain in that way.
Yeah.
How old were you when you recall realizing, oh no, I'm not actually supposed to express pain. I'm supposed to be a man in a certain way and act a certain way. Do you recall how old you were and what that was like growing up?
Yeah, 2020. So, you're talking about a man having a wife, a kid on the way, and really starting to figure this stuff out. I think with the pandemic and some of those transitions, me moving to a different city, no friends, an environment of work that's totally transitioning, and a wife who was like, hey, you might be experiencing some things that look like somewhat like minor depression. So I think at that point as an adult realizing, wow, I don't even know how to express these things, let alone like putting a name on them, just kind of suppressing them.
So you recognized it when she pointed it out and she used the D word, depression.
Yeah.
But before she said that, you were experiencing all of these things. What was the story in your head?
The way I processed through any of that throughout my whole life was there's other people who have worse things going on than me. So I'm not going to express my stuff because someone else is dealing with something more. And if I do, I'll feel like, oh, woe is me. So I really suppress things. So when that list of things came up, whether that's, depression or just focusing on job changes, I really did not know how to handle it.
It's interesting because you do what a lot of men do when they're feeling bad. You're feeling bad, you're feeling sad, you're feeling distressed in a certain way. And what a lot of men do is they look around and they go, other people have it worse. Yeah. So I, therefore, can't complain. My pain is not legitimate because there's somebody who has more pain than me.
Yeah.
Even though you can always find someone who has more pain than you, and it actually has no bearing on the legitimacy of yours, but you excuse it in that way, and then you dismiss it, and that means you don't actually have to do anything about it.
I think that's the part that's so key. If you do that, you don't have to do anything. When I looked at it from the lens of, I am so grateful I have a partner who is like willing to say, I see this in you. That's like so key. So it was something where, I had to really say, therapy, like really? Like, are people going to think something more of me that I'm in therapy? Because it can have a negative connotation. And being on this side and seeing like what it's done for my family, my relationship, me as a father, me as a friend, me as a coworker. And obviously it's an ongoing thing. I'm not like fixed by any means, but it's nice to put the work in and see something from it.
Now, when your wife pointed it out to you, hey, I see all these things, and she used the depression word, she was commenting based on what you were seeing at home with you, because that's where, but looking back, how did it show up at work? And what were the signs you were missing when you were working that something might have been going on?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's important because it allows me to reflect back on that. Because with this stuff, it was like, I don't really know when I've been like more about a situation than I should have been. And like, how do you process when you look at your life and say, oh man, that reaction probably came from something deeper that I just never took care of.
Yeah.
And, and then you look at like relationships with your family, or I could have said this differently now, being someone in therapy, than when I was in that situation, in that conversation. And so I'll give you an example. I've had really hard conversations with my dad. And my expectations of that conversation was, Dad, I need you to meet me where I'm at. But then after the conversation, I'm like, this is a man who's never really been to therapy and hasn't really worked on himself in that way. How can I expect him to show up for me where I'm at? So I need to have some grace with him and say, hey, like, these are some of the things I'm doing to grow. Would you be interested in growing with me? And then from there, revisit those hard conversations. It was somebody who's also growing.
Yes, and how open was he to, because that's not a world that he was familiar with. It was one, and you probably had that conversation once you had learned quite a lot and done quite a lot of thinking and reflection. So you're coming at it with an advantage of experience and know-how and awareness that he doesn't have. How do you breach that gap with him when you're having that kind of conversation?
Yeah, you can see the love. You see him say, yeah, I think that's important. Yeah, we should do it. But the follow-through hasn't been there. And so when I go back to the therapy...
On his end.
On his end. Okay. And then you go back into the therapy session and your therapist is like, hey, like, your dad is from a time where this stuff wasn't even spoken about. So the expectations of you thinking he's going to want to dive into this is pretty high. So if you love him and you want to work on it, do it. But know that there's a chance that movement never happens. And so I look at myself as a father now, a friend, a husband, willing to put the work in and following through on it are the things that I think are the most important. And I see that in my relationship with my wife. And, we're really proud of each other because we do therapy once a month together as a couple. Mm-hmm. And what that's done for our marriage, just, if you're not growing with each other, 5 years into a marriage, you can have a different wife. She's grown so much. And so I kind of call it like the best dates we ever have in therapy. Because you get done, you're like, we just fueled into each other. I feel like we both came to the table to grow together. It's almost like you're picking these weeds before they get too big to overcome the flower. So it's like, boom. And you leave, you're like, oh, that was so lovely.
You've really embraced this change in thinking, in doing, in being. But as you said, you had hesitations. There was stigma attached. How did you get over the hesitations, the stigma? What was it that helped you go from, I don't know if it's for me, kind of a reflection of your dad, to being able to move past that? Like, what were the things that helped you get over that hurdle?
To me, it's my responsibility to make sure I'm the best version of myself. You're going to have to unpack a lot of stuff. But then as you start unpacking it and you realize a problem shared is a problem halved, and then you get into it from a personal level to your relationship, and it's like, oh my gosh, like my number one takeaway from like marriage therapy is it's not my intentions, it's the impact it had on her. And like when I figured that out, oh my gosh, it like alleviated so many fights because It's like, I'm sorry. It didn't matter what I meant. Like you were hurt by that and I'm sorry for hurting you. Like that to me was like a game changer.
It's such an interesting thing because your journey is one that's reflected among many, many men. Many men will embark on the journey for someone else that they love, for their wife, for their kids, for someone else because it's easier to do it for them. Once they embark on the journey, they begin to recognize and see, and then it becomes for them as well. Was that your experience?
Yeah. And you don't really think of that until it's said to you. And it's true. And I wonder why that is, because I think there's something so powerful to be like, no, this is for me. And then from this being from me, it impacts my family and everyone else in such a positive way. And there's one thing I love that you say. It's like, don't focus on the goal, focus on the next step. And I talk to people so much about just being kind to themselves because they say something negative about themselves while at the gym doing the thing that's getting them to where they're trying to go. I'm like, you got to be kind, like focus on being proud of yourself right now. Because if you do this again tomorrow, then the consistency of that makes big change.
It requires a lot of strength to do that work. It's actually not about weakness. It's about being strong enough to confront, to face, to deal with very uncomfortable things.
Yeah, I think that's really impactful. Because it just like, it makes me emotional and like, oh, wow, I wish I did this sooner, but also like emotional, like happy that there's this resource for people, you know, and I think getting out there and like talking about this stuff, because the harboring and the way it comes out in other areas of your life is wild. But to like actually step forward into change and see the fruit of it and what it can be for your family, your relationship is so important. For others, like it's really neat to see. And that's why, you know, and I think it's also something I share a lot with people. I'm in therapy. I share a lot of things in my life, things that would potentially be attached to masculinity that some people really do have a hard time with. And you'd be surprised how many men are like, you did that? And I'm like, yeah. Even you talking about the suppression. My whole life was a suppression. Whether that, you know, it's just, and then all of a sudden it's like, you just start throwing this stuff out. And it's like, wow, it feels so good, you know, to get it out.
Yeah.
Writing it down, anything.
If there's somebody who's watching, a man who's watching, who really sees themselves in your story, who really identifies with you and especially where you were before you started this journey, what's one small thing that they can do that's concrete that would help start them on the journey or help point them more directly towards that recognition and embracing that journey?
There was this moment a week ago where I looked at myself in the mirror and I was just like, you say you want these things, but your action behind it is not where it needs to be. And I just looked at myself and I was like, if this is what you want, go do the actions necessary to get to where you're trying to be. And I think very similar in this whole world of mental health and therapy, it's like, if I want a fruitful relationship with my wife or to be a better father, like, and there's these tools that I can step into, really, no matter what the stigma is behind it or what you think of it, it is worth it to better yourself, because to better yourself betters everyone else around you. And so I would just say it's worth it.
I think that's great. And I would just add to that, one thing that people can say to themselves is, maybe I don't have to live with this kind of pain all the time.
Yeah.
Maybe there's an option. Maybe I can explore it.
It all goes back to focusing on what I'm feeling and how can I get through this to make myself better for everyone. So,
CJ, thank you so much for sharing your story and for coming on the Visibility Gap. I think it's going to help a lot of people, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate you.
Joining us now is Dr. Curtis Jasper, a psychologist, author, and speaker who specializes in culturally grounded therapy for men, and Dr. Carlos Kelly, a professor of English focused on Latino studies with a specialization in masculinity. Welcome, both of you, to the Visibility Gap. Dr. Curtis, when you hear a story like CJ, somebody who's strong on the outside but struggling on the inside, what does it tell you about how boys and men are taught to handle emotions?
It tells me that boys and men are socialized to be externally strong, right, without even considering the internal strength. And I thought CJ did a great exemplification of just the calmness on the inside, the peacefulness, but the external looked very powerful. And so what shows up for me is that culturally, historically, right, across a number of cultures, men are taught to first be mindful of their presentation from a physical standpoint and make sure that that's strong.
Right, and they're very much taught to be very aware of what you're presenting on the outside and pretty much ignore anything that's going on.
Disregard the inside
on
altogether.
The inside,
right.
Yes,
right.
yes. And Dr. Carlos, what's your experience been in how really that traditional upbringing for men teaches them how to manage their feelings?
Yeah, I think about this from sort of a pop culture perspective and how we're taught these lessons and reinforce those lessons through the media that we consume, and whether it's books, TV, comic books or video games, etc. And what I see in CJ is a lot of unlearning. And that's highly valuable skill for men to have, because we need to recognize that the lessons that we've been socialized to internalize and to perform, that those aren't useful to us in many situations, perhaps all. And so that we need to think about ourselves and be introspective about what it is that we've learned. Is that useful to us? And how can, if not, then how can we unlearn it? And so I think what I see in CJ is that power to question himself and to unlearn the things that are no longer useful to him.
And I think unlearning is such a useful way to think about what needs to happen, because what that implies is that the default is to do things a certain way. The default is to ignore. So when you're not being mindful, when you're not being thoughtful about what you're doing and how you're managing, then you're going to go back to the default, and that's what you have to unlearn. Unlearning takes a lot of awareness and a lot of mindfulness.
Absolutely.
Because otherwise you just go back to the way you're used to doing things. You know, like most men never really seek professional help, even when they're truly suffering.
Yeah.
On the inside, what do you see as the biggest hurdles, both internally and externally, for men really seeking support more?
I think it's a few things, right? I think men wait too long to ask for help, right? From my experience working with men, black men in particular, it's the wait, right? It's the unrecognizing suffering until it becomes, almost impossible to ignore. But the embarrassment of asking for help has been, given to men across traditions, across cultures. Just asking for help in and of itself symbolizes weakness and vulnerability. And that goes against, the externalization of what masculinity once was. I want to be clear about once was.
Very much so. And culturally, what do you see as the external impediments for men asking for help? What are they seeing around them that's really making them hesitant?
You see it on TV, you see it on, I go back to media because this is where sort of more in my realm, but you see men handling things on their own, right? And you don't see the consequences or the implications around the relationships that are taxed because we're not seeking help, or that end or fail, etc. And it's not a symbol of weakness, but it's like we all need guidance at some point. We don't make it on our own.
I agree. And I think those barriers, both the internal ones that you spoke about and the external ones that you spoke about, where I think they probably show up most is in the workplace. Because of the expectations that we have in the workplace around productivity, around leadership, around performance, around the expectation of just pushing through and getting things done. How is that impacting men's ability in the workplace to recognize when they're having mental health struggles?
When you externalize what you're feeling, it doesn't come out productively, right? If you're holding everything in. And so in the workplace, you can be holding all these things in and you can snap at someone, and then there could be consequences that involve, correction or firing, etc. And then that just leads to more negative effects. I've been there in the sense of expecting I should always be productive. I've tried to heal that mindset, to allow myself the space to rest and to say that, I don't always have to be productive.
In what other ways in the workplace do you think these mental health struggles might be expressed when men are holding them in, when they're actually not addressing them, when they're not getting help or support? How else are these things expressing themselves? How is it coming out?
For a lot of men, it's coming out through their physical health, right? Men are really, really succumbing to physical challenges as a result of holding things in. You mentioned earlier about it coming out at the workplace. I actually think the majority of it comes out in the home life because men are conditioned to perform at work, right? They just get up and they hit go and they perform until they can't. It becomes challenging when they become physically ill. That's really when it shows at work. I mean, it literally shows when a man has almost, quite frankly, worked himself to death. I find that the majority of the men whom I'm fortunate enough to work with are simply exhausted. And I'm not talking physical exhaustion. I'm talking emotional and mental exhaustion. And that manifests for a lot of men into different physical and, health challenges.
That's absolutely right. You see, burnout, which is about exhaustion fundamentally, what really contributes to burnout is when these stresses accumulate, especially work stresses. They're not being dealt with, they're not getting expressed, they're just bottled up continually. And the bottling up, the lack of an ability to talk about them, to manage them, to ease them in a certain way is one of the factors that are contributing to the really high levels of burnout that we're seeing in the workplace. But you believe that, it's more at home that these things are going to be expressed because you don't have the cover at home of just getting things done, of being productive, of putting your head down and doing things. And so
Correct.
that's where it's more likely to come up. Do you agree? Is it home? Is it with friends? Is it work? Where are these things going to be missed most?
Sure, I tend to agree because there is that expectation that you're at work, and so you have to comport yourself in a way that may not allow this. And I think that in my life and in my experience, you hurt the people you love because you think that they're going to be there no matter what because you love them and they love you. And so there's this sort of taking for granted of those relations. And so I definitely agree that when you're done performing and you're exhausted and you come home, you also have to perform a certain level of care for your partner, take care of each other. And when you're exhausted and you're stressed and you do all this at work, it may come out not at work, but at home.
Exactly.
And that certainly happened to me. I mean, I don't pretend to be a perfect man. I think that the struggle with masculinity is a lifelong sort of pursuit. And those of us who start to pursue different ways of thinking and being, the sooner the better, of course. But I think culturally, we're just not there. And this is why this podcast is so important, because I think that it's starting to show us that through modeling these behaviors or through other men speaking about these things, that it's okay to do it. I think that we need to give ourselves permission sometimes to feel. I hope that more people, or more men specifically, and people in general, give ourselves the permission to feel these things so that those situations don't happen, so that we don't snap at someone, or so we don't take that baggage home and reproduce the harm onto our partners.
And I think that's something that we really see a lot happen in the people that we work with, that transfer of those pressures from work to home. We call them spillover and crossover effects. That all those pressures and tensions that you are holding and dealing with during the workday, as you said, that you just kind of put your head down and get stuff done, so you haven't really dealt with them. Then you get home, and there they spill out and affect our relationships and affect our partners tremendously.
For a number of reasons, right? I mean, you're off duty, so things spill out, right? You come home, you literally kick off your shoes, you take off your armor, you stop performing, whatever your uniform is, and it sort of just seeps out in various ways. So, yeah.
And I've also seen, I don't know if you've seen this, that, most men, when I talk to them and I say, well, how much is that spilling over from work to home? Oh, no, I have that under wraps. I leave it at the door. And then when you ask their partners or the families, they're like,
I don't think so.
Yeah.
and it brings up the issue of culture, of race, of class, because all those things really impact our experience and our perceptions of masculinity. How do those things influence who really feels more able to speak up, who feels more able to confront these things versus people who feel very inhibited because of culture, race, or class?
That's an awesome question, Dr. Guy. I could tell you from the lived experience of being a black man, right? You have to really give yourself permission to redefine what masculinity is. And for a lot of men, that takes decades, if at all, right? I'm almost 55, and it has taken me, right, not too long ago, where I had to really detach from cultural normalities and expectations and define what it means to be masculine.
It really is important to show that we can model a new way of masculinity.
And that modeling, CJ spoke really clearly about the external definitions of masculinity versus the internal ones, how that shows up and plays out differently, what's on the outside versus what's on the inside. Talk to me a little bit more about what's on the inside, about how those distinctions between what's on the external, what's in the internal, in terms of our perceptions of masculinity are playing out.
Sure. So like, I'm a really tall guy, I mean, I guess not NBA height, but I'm tall, and a big guy. And so there's this assumption that I can withstand like physical pain and emotional pain, right? So those external perceptions are imposed upon me. When quite frankly, I'm a softie. I cry, commercials, like I'm crying at everything, under the sun. So, and that they don't square, right? And so if you're an emotional guy like me, but you're expected to be hard or tough, how do you square that without interrogation, introspection, without education? And so the external and internal divides can be really confusing to somebody who's trying something new, right? And it doesn't help too, like if you are emotional, and somehow patriarchy is being reinforced around you, whether through, women, men, it doesn't matter where it's coming from, but the patriarchal pressures are constantly being reinforced.
Yeah, I mean, perception is real, right? What you perceive is what you deem to be reality, at least in the present tense. And so from a masculine standpoint, it shows up different for different people. Like I'll use myself for example. I mean, initially I'm a typical black man, right? Bald with a gray and beard, right? And oftentimes my initial appearance is, will come with the stereotypes based on racism and oppression until I open my mouth, until I converse, until they read my background and they sort of feel safe. They give themselves permission to take he's safe now. I think he's safe. He seemed to be safe until it comes out again, because again, I am who I am. So the perception is reality. Oftentimes it's just misperceived. And different groups, I've seen tons of men pay for it in one way or another in various ways, just based on how they're perceived, without actually understanding, right? What I found, not just personally, but professionally, is it's the lack of understanding that keeps us disconnected, right? Having real, true dialogue will allow just anybody to sort of just feel, not understand, not even agree, just sort of feel for a minute, right? None of us are exempt from emotions.
Right.
That's a fact, right? It's part of just who we are. What I find is men have been trained, and I use that word specifically, trained to keep the emotions bottled up. They don't do emotions. They can't be emotional, so they suppress. They hide emotions, which will in fact come out. And it's not a matter of if it comes out. It's really just a matter of when.
Tell me more about the isolation that you see and why that's happening.
Yeah, men are lonely. Men are lonely. Active men are lonely because of the lack of true connection, right? We're still performing. So we have these group sessions, we have these podcasts, but it's still performative, right? I'm a part of a lot of organizations on the local level, and you go to a men's group, and instead of standing up and sharing from the heart, men perform from the head, regurgitating stories. So now mental health has been intellectualized, because now we get to stand up and see who's the best public speaker as we talk about our history of some of the challenges that we experience. So I think we could do a better job of speaking from the heart. Right. My job is to really get over the warm and fuzzy clinical stuff to males in the form of distinction and teachable moments so they can receive it.
Okay, but that depends also on the kind of language
Correct.
that we have. Do we have the right language to talk to men about mental health at the moment?
That's an awesome question. That's probably, from my professional standpoint, the number one challenge is that we have to redefine, reframe, and recontextualize the language around mental health, right? Because it's a lot of things. It's different. It may show up in physical symptoms for one gentleman. It may show up in grief. There may be trauma, right? And so I find that really put it in a teachable format, right? Here's what I know. All of the males that I deal with, they have some form of schooling. So they get the transfer of what it means to be taught. What we cannot do is teach them all of these clinical terms, these mental health terms, share memes about what it means to, it's okay to be okay. We can compartmentalize this, all of the stuff, as opposed to saying, hey, man, those are some fresh kicks. Oh, and by the way, you seem pretty sad. Everything is okay? And using basic third grade terms, right? Like sad. It takes an older man for me to say, last week I was feeling kind of sad, so that a young male could say, oh, he's still cool. He used the sad word. He's still cool. And we have to exhibit it. We have to demonstrate it, as opposed to intellectualizing mental health.
And I think that's really important, because what you're saying is, and I know this word sad is such a simple, basic word, right? But it's not what we associate with mental health.
Correct.
And when you expand the definition, when you expand the language, when you are expanding the dialogue that we have about what actually mental health is, to make it much broader, because it's quite broad, then it brings more people into the conversation.
Correct.
Because sad, everyone feels once in a while.
Yes, sir.
But no one is like, oh, that's a mental health issue. It's not necessarily a mental health issue. It's an entree into a conversation about mental health. And I think that's really important. I want to pivot to the workplace, because overworking is a thing, and it's really damaging. What do companies need to do to open up more resources to address overworking, to create the space to discuss it in appropriate and healthy ways? What can companies do differently than what they might be doing right now?
I think leaderships of companies can do better by simply telling the truth. Like just being honest about what it is, right? This whole message of shooting it down the chain of commands about working yourself grid and what that'll do for your career long term. I just think it's dishonest and disingenuous, right? Knowing that you're telling your team that they need to work harder until it becomes unavoidable. Burnout is from a corporate standpoint, shows up in different ways, right? You start having absenteeism, people start changing jobs, people start passing away in different health challenges. That's when the alarm is sounded, right?
Well, it's interesting, because what I'm seeing in my work is it's often leadership who are no better off in terms of they're overworking themselves, and to a fault. They're also doing themselves no favors. And I think, to me, one of the most important things that leaders can do, and by leaders, I mean it can be a shift supervisor at a coffee place, or it can be a CEO, is open a dialogue. Make it legit to talk about overworking. What's the impact? How is this affecting you? What if it's too much? Like by modeling that it's okay to have a conversation, I think that can legitimize it throughout all levels of an organization. And I think that would be a great first step. I have one final question for each of you.
Sure.
I'll start with you. What is masculinity in 3 words? What is it?
Masculinity is safety, consideration, health.
Safety, consideration, health.
Yeah.
I was thinking about them.
He took 3 good ones.
You took all mine. No, I think grace and compassion. I think those two. We need to have grace for ourselves, who we were,
It's good.
and who we're going to be, right? And that journey, we need to have a little bit of compassion, because we're going to struggle in that journey. I'm going to say to introspection. Without introspection, I don't think any of us will learn about who we are. But we also need to have the space to introspect. And so I go back to the work stuff, like CEOs can give us the space. If they really cared, they can give us the space to think about those things, and that requires rest, and also requires compassion for your laborers.
It's good.
Right?
Thank you very much for this really great discussion
Thank you for having
that
me.
we've
thank you.
had, and thank you for coming. I think what we covered today is how the barriers that men face in terms of how they define masculinity, how it's expressed at work, in their personal lives, really inhibit them from getting the help that they need, from feeling very hesitant to reach out, to get support. And what are some of the changes that we need to see in terms of how we define masculinity to ourselves, how we define it culturally, how we define it in the workplace, and certainly how we talk about it? That those things need to happen for men's mental health and men's ability to deal with their mental health, to really take some steps forward and catch up with where we are today in the world and where we should be in terms of talking about these things. Thanks for joining us. We hope today's stories help shine a light on men's mental health and remind you that no one has to navigate these challenges alone. Tune in to the rest of the season and like, share, and subscribe.